John Conley, and I'm a member of the Education Committee that puts these programs together every month. I would like to introduce our speaker. One of the world's most pressing challenges is to provide sufficient, nutritious food for people in all parts of the world, including right here in Livingston County, in Western New York. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Karen Berger, will be sharing with us her take on the demand side of food systems. She will also speak about the health, environmental, and economic implications of dietary choices and strategies that could improve food distribution and reduce food waste. Dr. Berger is well qualified to speak on this important topic. She's an associate professor of instruction in the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department at the University of Rochester, where she has been for the last 13 years. Her teaching portfolio includes courses on water, energy, and sustainable systems. Her academic training is in environmental engineering and energy resources. Outside of this academic work, Karen Berger serves as chair of the Brighton Conservation Board and is vice president of local nonprofit Color Brighton Green. Without further ado, I give you Dr. Karen Berger.
John, for having me, and thank you all for coming out. Looks like you got a lot of rain from the size of your puddles, so appreciate you coming. So what I wanted to talk about was food systems. We all eat, we all think about where our food comes from. So looking at trying to get a healthy and sustainable food system. And so the big question kind of underlying and framing this talk today is, as mentioned, can we provide sufficient nutritious food for all people while staying within planetary boundaries? And there's really several components to this. So the first issue is providing enough nutritious food, creating enough nutritious food. I would say the second aspect of that is getting it to the people who need it, which has multiple challenges. And then the last component is staying within planetary boundaries. And so these boundaries include both the physical resources like land and water, and also the planet's ability to absorb pollution, absorb emissions into our water and the atmosphere. So we expect global population to plateau probably between 9 and 10 billion people, which is about 1 to 2 billion more than we have right now. So we obviously have to produce more food than we are now. But we also have to make sure that we're getting that food to people. We're not even meeting the food needs of everybody today. So I wanted to start briefly by talking about food insecurity. And I'm going to start global and then sort of work down in spatial scale. So this is a map from our World in Data, which is a fantastic site with more data than you could possibly want. And the color shading, which hopefully shows up reasonably well, is looking at the percentage of the population in these different countries that have moderate or severe food insecurity. And the way they define this, moderate food insecurity is more about having enough healthy, nutritious food, and severe food insecurity is if you don't even have enough calories. And so you can see that from the dark red, clearly, sub-Saharan Africa has the highest rates of food insecurity, above 90% in some of these countries. But there's also places, Haiti is 83% of the population having some level of food insecurity. Afghanistan is also close to 80%, Yemen over here, and others in Southeast Asia that are above 50, 60%. I also want to point out there's a lot of countries we don't have data for. So for example, China and India, the two most populous countries in the world, don't share or don't publicly track this data, and a number of other countries as well. But you can see that food insecurity is an issue in many places. If one looks at the US, The number that shows up in this data is that it's about 8% for the United States as a whole. It's down a little bit from what it was about 20 years ago, but that hides a lot of variability that we have even within the country. And so this is a map, I think this was on the flyer for today, that's looking at the county scale at levels of food insecurity. And so the darker green it is, the higher the percentage of people facing food insecurity, defined here by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, when people don't have enough to eat or don't know where their next meal will come from. So this maxes out at about 60%, but I think one of the points that's worth noting is that in the lower blue box, 9 out of 10 counties with the highest food insecurity rates are rural. So this is really an issue in many places, particularly in the southern United States, but also in rural counties. So then if we zoom even more into Livingston County, I was looking up some information that the county government had shared on their website last year, and there's the results of 2 different surveys that were done on this topic. And so the first one was done by Livingston County themselves and found that close to 1/3 of people who filled out the survey didn't get adequate food in a given day. That's not talking about whether it was nutritious or not, but just didn't get enough food. And the causes that were highlighted were financial limitations and the accessibility of grocery stores. Another study that was done by New York State the following year may have asked the question a little bit differently, but they found that about 14% of adults reported having food insecurity within the last 12 months. And one of the things they highlighted in the New York State survey that was really focused on health was that there's a lot of correlation with chronic diseases. And I think what's really important when we think about sufficient food and chronic disease, that relationship goes both ways, right? So having a chronic disease might make it more difficult for you to get to a food store and be able to afford that food store. And then also not having enough healthy food could exacerbate some of those chronic diseases. So I mentioned a couple there, but it also included things like strokes and asthma and kidney disease. So a number of things where these issues are really intertwined. So thinking about food systems is really important for thinking about health and well-being. There are a lot of different reasons for the food insecurity, but I wanted to highlight a couple that came from an organization called Feeding America. They were the ones who tracked that county level data and were highlighting the issues in rural counties. And they highlighted 3 particular causes that they saw for this insecurity. So one of them being transportation challenges, if it was a longer distance that had to be traveled to get to where food could be purchased, and if people were more likely to lack a car or have access to public transit. They also highlighted wages that on average rural jobs are often lower wage, might not be full-time. So you could have economic challenges. And then they also looked at the role of racism and discrimination in terms of food access, highlighting that rural Blacks, I think, were 2.5 times higher rates of food insecurity, and that Native American counties with high Native American populations had really the highest rates of food insecurity. So things to think about. So what I want to do now is turn to the different components of the food system and think about what components influence the stress on planetary boundaries and what influences how much we produce and how we get it to people. So this is one very simplified food system. I like thinking a lot in terms of systems and interactions. And so, if we start at the top, you start with producing food. It might get distributed and aggregated, processed in some way, marketed, purchased, prepared. And ideally, it's a closed loop when if you've got food waste, it can be used as nutrients going back into food production. Obviously, many types of food don't follow this process. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think another key element that's not shown in this slide, and that might be even more that's an important component in rural areas, is sort of the direct from producer to consumer, right? So whether it's farm stands or farmers markets or things like that, So again, this is a simplified. So there should be on my screen, there's a gray arrow going directly from food production to purchasing, which is not showing up on your screen. So if we look first at sort of the issues with the planetary boundaries, I want to start with looking at food production. That's where most of those impacts are. We've got issues with how much land we're using to produce food, how much water, pollution from nitrogen and phosphorus getting into water systems, loss of biodiversity if we're going from diverse ecosystems to monoculture or fewer crops, and then also greenhouse gas emissions that come from food production. So that's the biggest source of these environmental impacts. Secondary are distribution and processing, but really these are the planetary systems we're thinking about most on the production side of the food system. I want to show on the next few slides some cumulative impacts of food production on different environmental indicators. And so this one is looking at 4 of those impacts that were talked about on the previous slide. And again, these are cumulative global indicators. So what has been seen is that agriculture is responsible for about 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's all types of agriculture, food as well, or meat as well as plants. So about half of our habitable land is used for agriculture. And when we look at freshwater withdrawals, about 70% is used in agriculture as opposed to used by industry and households. And eutrophication, when too many nutrients get into water and cause overgrowth of algae, close to 80% of that is coming from agriculture. So we can see our, food systems have a lot of impacts on these planetary challenges. There's a lot of work going on to expand production without increasing this footprint. So that's things like, improving fertilizer management, improving irrigation efficiency, looking at what is fed to cattle to reduce their methane emissions. All sorts of innovations are happening. That's not the main thing I wanted to talk about, but I think it's important to talk about sort of as framing the planetary stresses of our food systems. But I want to focus a little bit more on the demand side. And so that's the other half of this food system drawing. And so, as was mentioned, I want to talk about implications of dietary choices, issues of food distribution and access, because we could be feeding a lot more people with the food we produce if we were distributing it in an efficient and effective way. And then get into talking about food waste, which is an issue at lots of different stages. So if I start with the implications of dietary choices, anytime I'm thinking about things, I often think about what are the drivers of this? What are causing things to be the way they are? And when we think about what drives the food choices we make, it starts off, we need enough food to be able to survive. So we need enough calories so that we aren't suffering from undernutrition, and we want that healthy food. So sufficient and healthy, we want to have the vitamins and minerals that we need. So that's kind of on a fundamental level, but then we get into questions of what is accessible. And so when I say accessibility as a driver of food choice, is what's available in the stores that I go to, what is provided to me from a food delivery service, or what can I produce in the particular climate, land, soil that I have. So those are all dimensions of accessibility. Connected to that is affordability, right? That's going to be a big driver of what foods people choose to eat. Culture is another huge impact. What are we used to eating? What do we know how to cook? I ask my students, how often do you eat meat? And I get a range from I'm vegetarian to I eat meat at every single meal because that's what my culture is and that's what I like and that's what I feel that I need. So huge range of this. There's also the question of desire, right? Which is both cultural and what I like what tastes good to me, what gives me pleasure. That's going to be a driver of the dietary choices. And then last, but definitely not least in our busy lives is convenience. So how quickly can I prepare it? How, and tie into access. Can I find it nearby? Or do I have to go to a specialty store to be able to get this? Or do I have to go directly to a farmer's market to get this particular thing? So all of these different factors tie into how we get our calories. And there is a resource that the National Geographic published. It's a little over 10 years old, but I still like it. And so this is a graph of the world's food consumption by calories. And so as of 2011, the average person in the world ate close to 2,900 calories a day, close to half of them from grains. So wheat, rice, and corn are about half, provide most of, are the biggest 3 contributors to calories. You can see sugar and fat over here in number 2, produce, dairy and eggs here in yellow, meat in red, and keep forgetting you're not seeing my mouse. And then other is the 6%. So that's an average. There's also at this website, they have lots of different countries, so lots of variation between countries. Just to show you 2 extremes, here's the US and Vietnam. And a couple things to notice, both the difference in total calories. So the average American in 2011 was eating 3,600 calories per day. And the average person in Vietnam was eating 2,700 calories per day. And I think just glancing at that, you can see the big difference between, say, the purple. For Americans, we're getting a lot of our calories from sugars and fat, versus Vietnam, grain is much more significant. That's one of the biggest things. And also, I think it's worth noting dairy and eggs. I like my cheese, I like my milk, right? Many of us do. And eggs for breakfast. So actually, you probably can't read those words at all, can you? They're very, very, they show up well on here, but they end up faint on the projections. But the purple is sugar and fat, the brown is grain, the green is produce, the yellow is dairy and eggs, right? So dairy is often small in many Asian countries, the red is meat, and the blue is other. When we talk about environmental impacts, one of the biggest things is how much meat we eat. And we're seeing changes as countries get wealthier, they tend to eat more meat. That's one of the big dietary changes, again, to that affordability. Meat is generally more expensive than a non-meat diet. And so these differentiations, you can only see red. I see different colors for different meat products, but I just want to highlight a few things from here. This is looking at calories per person per day from meat. And so if you look at the axis, the vertical axes here, you can see that for the US, we're close to 500 calories per day per person. China has gotten up to about that amount during large economic growth in the 20 years prior to this.
What's interesting? The words and arrows and things are showing up in Zoom.
Oh, interesting. Okay, just can't see them here. Yeah. That's okay. It's just a reminder that I have to be mindful about what I'm pointing out. China's biggest meat component is pork. Again, culture and habit. Argentina, down on the bottom right, I didn't know until researching this a little more. Argentinians eat more beef per person than any other country in the world. But I think one of the things that's really striking is how variable it is, which has a lot to do with economics. So you can see there's pretty significant variability. Almost all of that variability is in beef consumption, which has been the highest. But they did say in more recent years, I was just looking up some articles more recently, that beef consumption is actually dropping, even in Argentina, because it's getting more expensive. And so affordability is an issue. And then also, if you look at India in the top right, you notice the average, there's a lot of vegetarians. So on average, it's more like 25 calories per person because there's so many people who don't eat any meat. But the next few slides are going to talk about the impacts of these dietary choices. So this is going to be a series of graphs that look at, this is looking just at land use. So the next slides will be in individual environmental issues and comparing different protein sources. But this one is looking at how land is used for agriculture. And I think one of the things that is striking to me is that about 40% of the crops that we grow are fed to animals. So when you look at cropland in the brown colors of the left, right? So about 60% of crops are directly fed to us, about 40% go to feed animals, and then we have lots of hectares, the metric equivalent proxy for acres, is pasture. And so that is significant, right, where animals are grazing. So that's current land use. That is about half of habitable land in the world. And one of the things they looked here was what happens if we change our meat consumption. And so if there was no beef or mutton consumed, so no beef cows, but in fact, beef from dairy cows was allowed. So at the end of a dairy cow's life, you could still access the beef. Then we would go from 4 billion hectares to 2 billion hectares, right? So we cut off a lot there just from the beef production. If we then cut out dairy, here in the third row, you've got no beef, mutton, or dairy. We would go down to about 1 billion hectares. And if we were all fully vegan, we would be at about almost exactly 1 billion hectares. So I am not encouraging or wanting you to come away with where I'm saying we all have to be vegan. I'm not vegan. I know many people are not vegan, will never choose to be because there's lots of different factors. But I think this is a helpful illustration of how reducing the amount of meat we have could lead to changes in land use that could be used for other purposes. So I think it's just about being mindful. There was an analogy that I liked that was from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. They were looking at how many calories of feed are required to make a calorie of beef. And they said that it's about 25 to 1, and gave the example that for chicken, it's about 9 to 1. So it's like you make 9 bowls of pasta and you throw 8 of them out, right? So thinking about the efficiency there. I have a couple other graphs. I'm not sure how they're going to show up, but I think you can see the colors enough that if I just call out a few things, you may be able to see. So this is a graph that's looking at greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm going to try to. So on the scale, these are greenhouse gas emissions. See that little guy, right? The little pointer. Per 100 grams of protein. And so this is looking per protein. These are all protein sources. We have animal-based protein up here. We have beef, lamb, farmed shrimp, cheese, pork, chicken, and eggs, farmed fish. And then down below, we have plant-based protein sources. So things like tofu and beans, peas, and nuts. And so what this is trying to show is a couple things. One is the white dots in the middle of each of these blobs, we call them that, is the median value. But then, so I think it's worth looking at the median value. Beef has a higher greenhouse gas emission than anything else by a long shot. But there's also a lot of variability in terms of how it's produced and where it's produced. And so I think that's an important point, that if you have the dairy sector has lower emissions because you're not just growing the animals to harvest them, you're also getting protein from milk and dairy products. So that's why these are dairy cows, which can be much lower than if you're raising the cows just as beef herds. And what's worth noting, so this is on this scale, this is 30, and beef herds actually go out to about 100. So over in the corner of that wall there, if we were really putting this to scale. So you can see other things also one thing that students often ask me about is, how can nuts be negative? And that's because most of the nuts that we're looking at are grown on trees. And so they end up taking up more carbon dioxide than the plants that they would have been replacing. And so you end up with net removal of carbon dioxide from the air. We also see that beans and peas are very low. And they also don't need fertilizer, which means they have other positive impacts as well. So again, this is sort of another summary that even the most efficient beef still probably has a higher climate footprint than some of your plant-based things. So that's again another thing to think about in thinking about the impacts. If we look at water, this is a study that was reproduced in the LA Times, the Los Angeles Times a couple years ago. If we look at the water footprint, this is now measuring it per calorie. Again, beef is highest, with a range down. It's not always that the plant ones have the lowest, but one of the things I like about this, and I don't know if you share slides out, but I'm happy to share these. I've got links at the end. This is a really fun website that the Los Angeles Times put together. I have students often go through this exercise. You can choose a different protein source, a different starch, a different vegetable, and a different drink, and see how the water footprint changes. And so it's kind of fun for them to say, what's the most water intensive meal I can have? What's the least water intensive meal? I'm always kind of sad when I do this because coffee does much worse than tea, but I really like my cup of coffee in the morning. The students will be comparing wine and beer, other things like that. So I really like things that can sort of help us visualize and help think about the choices we're making. So again, we may not feel like water is the biggest priority. We live in upstate New York with lots of water, but many of the places where these foods are produced are water scarce, and it's helpful to be thinking about those impacts as well. So I'm trying not to be preachy, but I did have this slide in here that I wanted to share. Again, in terms of arguments for eating less meat, we're trying to feed more people. So the more plants we eat, the more efficient we are, the less waste we have in eating higher on the food chain. There are also the environmental impacts that we look at, public health impacts of meat consumption in terms of, whether it's cholesterol or other issues that we worry about with some types of meat. And then for some people, a real motivating factor is ethical treatment of animals and also worker in animal production systems. Certainly not saying that is a universal issue. There's many different ways these things can be raised, but it is something that is, on the minds of some people. One of the things that I think is an interesting innovation happening is there's a lot of work happening around lab-grown meat, where they take animal cells basically and grow things that are like animal products. There is work in that was approved by the FDA a couple of years ago. And so basically right now it's very unaffordable. It's in a few high-end restaurants in big cities out west. But it might, if it scales up, that may be some way to allow affordability, reduce the planetary impact, but also allow people to eat the meat that they want, and for some people nutritionally need. I'm going to pivot next to the next one, but I just wanted to pause and see if there are any questions before I move on, if that's okay to ask questions at this point. Any questions, comments?
Why do you think that there's so much food insecurity like in Africa and not up in the northern parts of Canada and Alaska where farmland isn't so prevalent?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of the challenge in a lot of Africa is part of it is climate, not having as many more droughts and severe weather insecurity, and also not having necessarily the distribution infrastructure as well. So even if there isn't as much agriculture in northern Canada, you may have a lot being grown in central Canada that can be more efficiently transported up there. So I think it's a combination of the lack of connections as well as the lack of production. Okay, a little bit about food distribution and access. That's a good segue actually to talk about that. I think one of the first things is communication and having different options. And so I was really impressed by what Livingston County had online on this link, Find Food Resources, about all of these different options for accessing food, and a mix of types. So some of it might be food pantries, some of it might be home delivered meals. So targeting different audiences as well as different ways of getting food to people. And even such things as community gardens, where you could be producing it yourself if you don't live somewhere where you can have a garden of your own. So letting people know what's out there is often a big challenge. And so, this does a really good job. Food Link, which is mentioned here, does exceptional work throughout this entire area in terms of communicating food resource information and providing those food resources. A couple other things that I think are sort of interesting new developments. There's a growing program to have prescriptions, medical prescriptions for produce or healthy food. So this is an example of one in southern Mississippi. So patients who have some diet-related chronic condition, that could be something like diabetes or high blood pressure, and who are receiving any one of these government benefits, actually get a prescription card that lets them get free fruits and vegetables at the store, right? So that's a good way of getting past the affordability issue. Also the access, because they provide these in the local stores, they make sure that they have this fresh produce. So this is really, I think, recognizing that connection between diet and health, and trying to say people who access the health system should be able to access foods that will help them be healthier as well. Another one closer to home, this one was recently announced. So Trillium Health got about $1 million from the city of Rochester to partner with Headwater Food Hub, which is an aggregator of locally produced food, and Equicenter, which I hadn't heard about before. I don't know if any of you know, but it is it's a farm that also has food production, really focuses on veterans and I forget what their other population is, but you can go, you can learn cooking, you can learn food growing. And so this is another similar program where patients who are food insecure, who again have some health issue that is related to their diet, get prescribed a monthly box of produce. So again, they get it for free. And one of the things they said is they wanted to make sure that people knew how to cook it, that there wasn't a barrier of, I'm giving you fresh produce, but it's not something that you're used to knowing how to produce. So they have nutrition education classes along with that. And they also include monthly visits to this farm so they can see how it's being grown and engage with that. So this is a program that's supposed to go on for close to 3 years. And I think the hope is that they'll be able to expand it after that. So those are sort of working with the health system to think about how to do this. I've also heard about a few urban hospitals where they have gardens, on the roof of the hospital, and patients can access some of that as well. A couple things, so beyond the distribution and the sort of access, another way to increase it is to produce more, especially in places that might be closer to people who don't have access to healthy foods, right? Who live in what are referred, food deserts. And so there are a lot of programs all around the country, around the world, I would say, to produce more food in cities. And so this is one in Minnesota. And again, they not only looked at having dinners, collecting seeds, doing a lot of planting, but also going to farmers markets, getting youth engaged, and even serving meals for people who wouldn't necessarily be able to do them. So this is one in Minnesota. This is another one in Michigan. They've spent a lot of work in Detroit to take properties that were abandoned. Obviously, you have to make sure the quality of the soil is okay, or you do it in raised beds, which is what Food Link is doing in some of its urban farms. But this was a large site where they produce a lot of food, and then they deliver it free to households that live nearby. And so again, getting that food affordable, accessible, you don't need transportation to get there.
Are these like the victory gardens where, a certain number of people have a patch? Or is this like run by a larger enterprise.
Yeah, so I believe that this one is an organization. But I know that this one in Minnesota, they have a lot of community garden plots where individual households or families can do it. So there's different models. I've visited the one, FoodLink has one up on Lexington Ave in the city. And again, this is one, it's old abandoned property that is contaminated. So everything is in beds that are closed on the bottom. And FoodLink grows certain things, but they also have a number of beds that have been, that can be rented for like $10 a year to people in the community. And I think that one is almost entirely refugee families who like to grow things that they can't necessarily find in the grocery store. So again, culture and access. So there's a lot of different models that we see in those. Taproot Collective is another local one, a local organization that's working on growing and educating about nutrition. They have a site right next to the Rochester Public Market where they grow food. So lots of different strategies trying to get food to people who might not otherwise have access to it. I want to turn lastly to the question of food waste, because the less we waste, the less we have to produce to be able to get food to the people who need it. So beginning with defining it, the way I'm defining food waste is that it's any food that was at some point edible that is not eaten by people. And so that can come from different things. It can come from, you served yourself too much and like if you're out, you throw it in the trash. You don't like it. As a kid, this was me in Brussels sprouts. I have since discovered the joys of Brussels sprouts. Or food that goes bad before you have a chance to eat it, right? That's another unfortunately common source of food waste. I do want to clarify that when we talk about organic waste, that is a larger category. So organic waste would be anything that's biodegradable that comes from a plant or animal, but is not taking out organic certification. But it might be things like banana peels, avocado pits, right? It's organic. It's comes from a plant or animal, but is not something that we're going to think of as edible. One caveat I always want to share here is that people's opinions about what's inedible varies. So I think of cantaloupe rind as inedible, but the chefs at U of R are working on pickling cantaloupe rind and putting it in salads, right? So there can be some creative ways to repurpose it, but for the most part, those are things that we're not going to, we're focusing on food waste that was at some point edible by most of us. A disturbing thing, this was a graph that was shown from a colleague at RIT looking at food waste in the United States. It said it's grown really fast over, since the mid 1980s. And I was trying to think about why that might be. And, my first thought was, well, we have more people. Like, so maybe we have more people, we're wasting more food. But the U.S., when I looked up the numbers, the U.S. population went up by about 40% during this time from 1985 to 2015, and food waste increased by 185%, right? So we are throwing out more per person. So lots of different factors probably. As food gets cheaper, we may be more likely to throw it out. As the population gets wealthier, again, relative to the cost of the food. If we're eating more meals in restaurants, right, there can be more food waste if you get served too much in a restaurant. I don't know if anyone has any other ideas about why we may be wasting more food. I don't know the answer, but it's something to think about. One of the things that I think is worth looking at is where is that waste happening? So more than half of it is happening at home, with restaurants in second place. Grocery stores don't waste quite as much as we expect. And then institutions, schools, hospitals, everything else like that. What happens to it? So the sinks of food waste, the vast majority of it goes into the trash, where it either goes to a landfill or an incinerator. Around here, mostly to a landfill. Little bit composted, little bit donated, but the vast majority of it goes into landfills where it takes up space, creates methane, and most importantly, is not going to people who could eat it. So if we go back to the food system, I think it's helpful to think about where waste can happen along these different stages, right? So if we think about during the production stage, you know, in agriculture, there could be items that get left in the field. You have more than could be harvested, maybe you aren't able to transport more, you don't have storage capacity. You know, it gets trimmed and the edible part gets left behind. I think especially at large scale farms, it rots before it's harvested. It gets damaged by pest or disease or flood or drought. Any of those things can lead to waste in the production system. In processing, things get damaged while they're being transported. Maybe they get excluded because they're bruised or they're poor quality, they're too small, they're too large. Retail spoils before it gets sold, or I think some stores will cull things from their shelves because it's misshapen or it's bruised. You know, I was watching a video that was people trying to go out and love the ugly fruit. And so, you know, say, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to choose all the misshapen apples because otherwise they're just going to get tossed. Or it's okay to take something that's bruised. And then on the consumption side, there's lots of different dimensions. You know, too much served, people don't like it. One of the things I was just talking to somebody who works in the public schools, and they were saying that the regulation in the school is that if you go to get lunch, you have to get every item that's offered. So even if you want milk, you still have to take everything, right? And so there's a lot of waste that happens there. And so that's, you know, a place where there is room for thinking about reducing the waste. I think it's worth thinking about how the waste is produced at different stages in different places. So the top 3 rows here are sort of the wealthiest countries, and probably unsurprisingly, we waste the most in the consumption stage. So this is looking not at total amounts, but of the waste that each region generates, at what stage of the food system is it produced. So we see also the highest agriculture and post-harvest loss can happen before it even gets to processing. You know, that can be an issue of not having cold storage, so something can, excuse me, can go bad before it gets to consumers, or if you don't have the infrastructure to gather it and transport it. So this was from an article in the New York Times a number of years ago now, but they included, one of the things that I thought was interesting is they included examples of things being done in some places to reduce the waste. And so in Africa, for example, they were saying they lost a lot of grain stocks due to fungus. And so there was organizations trying to put in metal grain silos to reduce the fungus. In India, they were looking, farmers traditionally collected tomatoes in big sacks, and they were trying to get them to use plastic crates so they wouldn't squish as many and lose crops, right? So some of the things that, you know, aren't necessarily high tech can still have big benefits on reducing food waste, but it's not a universal solution. It varies a lot depending on place. So I'm going to give you kind of a hodgepodge of strategies for reducing food waste. I'm going to start with a tech one first. So there's a company called Mineral, which is a moonshot project of X. And X is not what Twitter was, but X is a spinoff of Google. It was basically they invested money in moonshot ideas, like what is a big problem in the world and how might we fix it? And one of the things they saw was a lot of food waste happening in agricultural systems. So they created these robots that sense a lot of things. So they estimate yield, but they also measure ripeness with their sensors. They can measure disease risk and really let farmers optimize output and kind of target remediation, right? So you can go and you can say, okay, this is a part of my land and I need to give a little extra fertilizer to or irrigate a little bit. So this was kind of a fun technology solution. There's also looking at energy systems. And so, as I mentioned, waste that might come from not having cooling. So India is getting even ever more extreme weather due to climate change, and the agriculture sector produces a lot of waste. So there's been efforts to provide these solar powered cooling cold storage units, that are off grid, that can be in remote locations, so you reduce food loss. And one of the things they pointed out for the project in India was that it doesn't just reduce waste, but it also lets them store the produce for later. And they were noting that people could sell later for a larger profit because they were able to sell, like there's the example of oranges. If they could sell them months after the harvest, they got 5 times the price, right? Because the price was low during peak harvesting time. So it was an economic benefit as well as reducing food waste. In terms of the food waste hierarchy, this goes from best to worst. So, the best thing to do is reduce food waste. I've gotten a lot of these ideas from different things I've been reading, and also sometimes from students and videos. But in terms of avoiding the surplus that we have, thinking about what you want to buy before you go to the store. The last 2 are ones I got from a video about food waste. Making, like, we often put the new stuff in the fridge, and the old stuff goes to the back, and then it's more likely to spoil. So the simple thing of putting the older stuff up front, and then also creating an eat me first bin. Like, what's the stuff that's going to go bad soon? Thinking about that. Trying to, select recipes based on what you have so it doesn't go bad. Different sort of food storage things, and probably lots of creative ideas for that. The next thing is edible food rescue, right? So donating food to people who can use it, whether that's to homeless shelters or other places. Composting at home, that's really the next best thing because it's small scale and doesn't require transportation. And I like pointing to this example in South Korea. It's not exactly home composting, but South Korea, small country, high population, they recycled 2% of their waste in 1995. Their landfills were filling up and they didn't want to build more incinerators. So they created a system of these cute little deposit things, and you buy a biodegradable bag and then you pay per weight, and they now recycle 95% of their food waste. So it's sorting it at home and then bringing it to these places and composting it there. New York State actually passed I'll say an organic recycling law in 2022. This took effect in the beginning of 2022 and was looking at big institutions that produce food waste. And so anything that produces too much has to donate or recycle the food waste if there is a facility to do so within 25 miles. One of the goals is, because of this, that should create a demand for these composting facilities. There are a number of exempt categories. New York City already has its own law, so it's exempt, and a number of other places that are exempt. But the DEC has a list of institutions, so it's things like colleges, universities, jails are not exempt. Seabreeze, Walmart, right? Some of these other places are really having to start doing this. So the goal is that places, even some of these places that are exempt, if they have a composting facility, might be able to take advantage of that. So it's really hoping to create the infrastructure and get more organic waste, so food waste plus our banana peels and other things like that, into out of the waste stream. So as I mentioned, some resources that I find particularly helpful. I love Our World in Data. It's got everything you could ever want to know. Eat Forum is actually an international organization that's been looking at food and health around the world. They have a new version coming out. They have a lot of great resources. Impact Earth is a local curbside composting program in mostly Monroe County, but they're trying to expand. And then there was a good Washington Post article that tried to make the point that composting is not just for people who live on farms or have lots of space. They also give examples of composting in apartments and different ways you can do it. So, you know, there's a lot of good things out there. So thank you. I would love any questions or comments that you all have.
I'm gonna make a comment about wasting food. My wife and I, whenever we go to a restaurant, they always give you way too much food. And so we always, you know, ask for a box or whatever. And we usually can make 1 or 2 extra meals out of it. But we had some friends from France that came over to visit us. And they were shocked that we would ask for a box to take home food. They said culturally, you know, they would never think to do that. We're in their, you know, maybe in some parts of Europe they would. But they said, oh my God, you're taking food?
But I guess they also were shocked by the serving size
yeah.
that we got here.
Well, yeah, I mean, they have that Nouvelle cuisine, which is not a whole lot of food on the plate, but you know, the idea that we don't think anything of it in America. You know, ask for a box or a styrofoam pack
Right.
to take home food. And so we try to minimize whatever, you know, waste we would have, just doing something like that.
That's great. Yeah.
And if they're left over, you're gonna feed them.
Yeah, definitely. So, there's lots of, right, that's a good way, so then you can come back to it later when you don't have something else in your refrigerator. So, freezers are wonderful food waste avoiders. Yeah, absolutely.
I just had a comment about this man's question about why is Upper Canada, which is, you know, tundra or whatever, not, you know, in a problem, whereas in Africa and other countries, they have this food insecurity. A lot of it has to do with potable water, especially in parts of Africa. For example, in South Sudan, which had a civil war and broke off from regular normal Sudan into its own separate country. And they realized that people were walking half to 3/4 of a day, spending all that time walking just to bring water home to cook with, food with. So the World Gardening, it's not an institution, but it's a group, started in South Sudan digging wells. And that the wells are supported by garden clubs, okay, of which the United States, most garden clubs belong to the National Garden Club, who support digging of wells. And it started in South Sudan and it's probably branching out to other countries. The reason South Sudan is doing so well now is because they have potable water. And the other parts of Sudan are constantly in civil strife, of fighting and killing because they don't have any fresh water. And South Sudan realized that by getting wells dug, a lot of which are paid for by garden clubs around the world, they have settled a lot of their problems, and now they're starting to grow their own food. And in this country, there's another program called the Navajo Big Dig. And on the Navajo reservations in the western part of the United States, they discovered that part of the problem there is potable water. So now garden clubs are supporting the Navajo Dig Deep project so that on the reservations, they have their own water, which they are digging wells for. And hopefully over the next 50 years or so, they will become more independent and help cut down on their food insecurities because they're able to grow their own food and not depending on other places to give them food. So those are just 2 programs that I'm aware of that are trying to change this food insecurity, which creates a huge mess of just not only not eating, but civil wars, strife, and other things, because they don't have any water.
Right, and I think, one thing that's such a good point, and it also adds in that food, health, water connection, because having an improved water source is also going to do remarkable things for human health in general, for avoiding waterborne disease, and also, as you say, the amount of time that people spend in many places traveling to get water is time that they're not spending doing other jobs, educating, usually women and girls who are responsible for that. So a whole host of issues that are tied into the water, food, what we talk about, the water food nexus there. Yeah, that's a good point.
We've got a couple of, I'll call them data type questions. In the beginning, you kind of talk about we've got so much land and, we can grow different things or raise things. It's kind of a finite, and we're feeding this many people, this is how much land we have. Is there data around the water, like, catching fish in the ocean type thing? Do we know what that capacity is? And is there any accurate type representation of, how much fish can we catch?
That's a really
before we run out of.
Right, that's a really good question, and interestingly, fish tends to be an entirely different conversation from land-based food systems. A couple trends that I can share with you are that the wild caught fish has been fairly stable, but the growth in farmed fish has been really significant in the last 30 years or so. So it's more than, I think it's more than half of our fish that we eat in the world is farmed at this point. And so
it makes it measurable for us, for the purposes of you evaluating it.
Right, and I think, what I've seen, I haven't yet done my fish lecture, so this is last year's memories, but, about a third of the world's wild fisheries are considered overfished. And so there's concerns about those. We're trying to address that by farming more, but of course there are impacts with that as well, in terms of where it's happening. But there are people who are saying this is how much fish we could eat. There's also some interesting work with genetic engineering happening. For example, with salmon. Salmon tend to eat more than they produce in terms of pounds of fish feed versus fish produced. And there's work, they've combined salmon with some genes from other types of fish species that can grow faster and need less feed. And so if you could really make it, because we love salmon, as a popular fish, if we can make it more efficient, then we can farm it in a way that can meet that demand without having to harvest, over harvest. We'll say the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a great card for different regions of the country about which fish are sustainable to eat and which fish you should try to avoid eating from how threatened the population is, right? So that can be a helpful resource.
Second part of our second question, I'm going to come back to the land. When we come, currently we're dealing with the bird flu, and we're having to kill 200 million chickens and cattle and who knows what. But does that have and maybe do you think it has a long-term effect on what happens with the food supply in general, or obviously it has an immediate short-term effect? I'm just wondering if there's any sort of a long-term expectation.
Are you thinking about whether it would somehow get into the land and you wouldn't be able to raise animals on that land, or just whether the population?
No, just if there's enough history or data that shows that we've been through something like this before, and I'm not sure we have, that there's a behavioral change.
Oh, yeah, I mean, there was the mad cow disease that really wiped out a lot of the UK's cattle population, and down to, you know, we have short memories.
Yeah.
You know, our culture, like our family recipes usually last longer than our memories of crises like that.
You didn't address too much about the effect of global warming, but as one little incident or indication, my wife and I went to Iceland 7 or 8 years ago, and we learned from some of the locals there that a lot of their fishing industry is completely gone because the water has gotten too warm, and a lot of the fish have moved elsewhere, and too far away for the fishermen to go after the fish. And so that would have an effect on the population as well as the fishing industry of a country that, you know, had a huge fishing industry going at one point. And that would change probably the amount of fish that the locals would eat, because it's harder to get to.
Yes.
Whatever.
Yeah, so I know the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, one of the things they looked at was fish production. And one of the things that worries me is that, you know, so they look at, you know, there are some places where the fish production for human consumption will increase and some places where it will decrease. One of the areas that they worry about it decreasing fairly substantially is Southeast Asia, where fish is an even larger part of their diet. Also along the coast of Western Africa, where there's both a lot of fishing for consumption, but also a lot of fishing to make fish feed that gets then sent to mostly to Asia for the farmed fish that we often eat in the United States. So these kind of global systems are certainly issues of concern. And I would say in terms of climate change, that's kind of a threat multiplier across everything I talked about, right? It's a threat multiplier about water. It's a threat multiplier about, you know, fish in the temperature, but also the well-being of animals, how crops can survive higher temperatures. You know, I know a lot of people are there are different opinions about genetic engineering, but of crops, and I think one of the potentials is the work that's happening to try to modify crops to be able to handle drought or flood, to be able to handle slightly saltier water. So it doesn't need to be perfectly fresh, to handle you know, extreme temperatures. And so that's, I think if we can have some of those positive benefits, then we can be a little bit more resilient. But there's definitely a lot of alarm in that front about whether we'll hit a tipping point in our food systems.
I just had a comment about genetic engineering. We have a friend who's his PhD was in genetic engineering, and part of his work and research was in parts of the world where the wheat product grows very tall, and the winds through climate change and whatever were flattening the crop before it could be harvested. Right? And it's in an area where there isn't a huge population to hand harvest the wheat. So his project was to work on some sort of genetic engineering to make the wheat produce a good product, but didn't grow so tall. And he was successful in doing that, but it was genetic engineering that made the difference.
So Karen, could you step forward on this side?
Can you see her on the camera, John? If she moves.
Stand in front of the podium.
You can stand in front of the podium. Karen, thank you for a very informative presentation. And we'd like to show us a little bit of our appreciation for coming here this evening and sharing so much from your body of knowledge with this certificate of appreciation. And my wife's going to take a picture.